As part of the ongoing 2021 Specialized Rockhopper Budget Upgrade Series, I'm planning to convert my wife's Rockhopper Sport 29 to a more modern 1x clutched drivetrain. However, before I do this, I can't help but want to convert the somewhat outdated, heavier square taper bottom bracket to the more modern Shimano Hollowtech II external bottom bracket, which is way lighter and compatible with more crank options. So in this video, I'll walk you through the bottom bracket conversion process and explain some of the more confusing bits about the enigma that surrounds bicycle bottom brackets. So the first thing you need to do is to remove the stock pedals and cranks. Now, you don't actually have to remove the pedals, but they're way easy to remove while the cranks are on the bike, so it's just something to consider. Now also remember that the drive side pedal is standard thread, but the non-drive side pedal is reverse thread, so righty-loosey. Ugh, that hurts my head to say. Now once the pedals are off, unscrew the crank arm bolts on both sides of the cranks. It also helps to break the chain so that it's out of the way when you pull the drive side crank arm off. Now it's not absolutely necessary, but we're replacing the whole drivetrain on this bike anyways, so now is a good time. Now with the crank arm bolts removed, you won't actually be able to pull a crank off by hand, as the whole idea of the tapered spindle is to create a really tight interference fit. So to remove the crank arm, you will actually need a crank puller, which consists of an outer threaded cylinder which is threaded onto an inner punch. Now the one I have here is a decently nice Park Tool one, but there are cheaper ones that do just as good a job. I'll put some links down below to a couple of crank puller options. Thread the crank puller all the way into the crank arm, making sure the inner punch is threaded far enough outward so it doesn't contact the tapered spindle. Then once the puller is tightly threaded onto the crank arm, you can thread the inner punch until it makes contact with the tapered spindle inside. Now at this point, you'll need to apply some decent torque on the crank puller to push the crank arm away from the spindle. Now once you break the initial friction, the crank arm should actually pull off pretty easily. And then go ahead and repeat the same process for the non-drive side. So now that we have the crank arms off, you can actually see the square taper bottom bracket. Now, in order to remove this, you do need another specialized tool to fit the bottom bracket, but they're also not too expensive. And I'll put a link down in the description to the one that I have here as well. Now, this part is probably the most critical, as if you strip the teeth on the bottom bracket, you're definitely going to struggle to get the bottom bracket out without resorting to bigger, more destructive tools. It's really important to remember also that for this stock bottom bracket, which uses the more common English thread, the non-drive side is regular thread, and the drive side is reverse thread, which remember is actually backward from the pedals. To make things a bit more complicated, if your bottom bracket happens to use the less common Italian thread, both sides of the bottom bracket use normal righty-tighty, lefty-loosey threads. Anyways, this is important as it usually takes a lot of torque to remove the bottom bracket, and you don't want to accidentally end up further tightening the bottom bracket when you're trying to remove it. Now, the best thing you can do is to have a long threaded screw go through the bottom bracket tool and into the bottom bracket itself so that it can't fall off center and you can really get some weight on the handle to remove it. Now in my case, I didn't have a bolt that fit, so if this happens to you, just be really careful to support the tool while you apply torque, as it's really easy to strip the teeth on the bottom bracket if the tool slips. Once both sides of the square taper bottom bracket are out, you can give the shell and the frame a good clean and re-grease the threads before installing the new external bottom bracket. Now the one I'm using here is the budget-friendly Shimano SMBB52, which is a solid part and will serve this build series pretty well. You will know that most bottom brackets come with these additional 2.5mm spacers. Now depending on your bottom bracket shell width and the type of bottom bracket that you're using, you'll need to use a different combination of spacers on the drive and non-drive side. I'll link to a great offroad.cc article that explains every combination down below in the description, but in this case we have a 73mm bottom bracket shell and we're using a Shimano brand Hollowtech II bottom bracket. So we only need to use one 2.5mm spacer on the drive side only. Again, the drive side is going to use reverse threading. Now ideally you'd have a separate bottom bracket socket that you can use in combination with a torque wrench to tighten to the specified 40 Newton meters, but I actually don't. So I tend to rely on experience to tighten to what I feel is close to the proper spec. Now 40 Newton meters is a lot of torque, but don't go too crazy when cranking it down. Now once your new external bottom bracket is installed, you'll need new cranks as your old square taper cranks are no longer compatible. Here I'm installing the, again, budget-friendly Shimano Diori M5100 cranks with a 32-tooth narrow-wide chainring in preparation for the full 1x drivetrain conversion. Now this is a Hollowtech II compatible crankset, and all cranksets with this design install the same way. You'll first grease the spindle and push the drive side crank arm through the bottom bracket. Then on the other side, you'll grease the splines on the spindle, and before you install the non-drive side crank arm, you'll actually need to remove one of the pinch bolts to rotate the plastic safety plate out of the way. Then slide the crank arm onto the spindle, making sure that both crank arms are parallel, and re-engage the safety plate, which prevents the crank arm from sliding off even if the pinch bolts come loose. Now, in order to create the compression of the crank arms onto the spindle, you'll need to tighten the crank cap using another specialized tool. Now, some tools like the bottom bracket tool I have here include this tool, but they're cheap nonetheless. Now, there's no need to over tighten this. You just want to make sure the crank arms are snugged up against the bearings and there's no side to side play of the crank arm spindle. Then you're going to incrementally tighten down the pinch bolts, alternating to the specified torque. It's usually printed on the crank arm itself, and in this case we're going for 12 to 15 Newton meters. And that's basically it. In my case here, we're also installing the new race face Chester pedals, which are pretty affordable, but such an upgrade over the stock resin pedals. Now, I realize this isn't a super sexy upgrade going from a square taper to an externally threaded bottom bracket, but I really feel that it modernizes the bike, and it can be argued that it's just an inherently better design that uses larger bearings and a wider footprint for the Hollowtech spindle, which may reduce flex and certainly reduces the weight. Now, in the next video, I promise a more transformative upgrade, as we will be replacing the fairly lackluster entry-level 2x8 drivetrain with a box components extra wide range 1x9 drivetrain. Yes, that's right, only 9 speeds to cover the same range as an equivalent 11 or 12 speed system. So will 9 speeds be enough? Am I crazy not to go 11 or 12 speed? I don't know, but we're gonna find out. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.